Hello, and welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today, we're going to venture into some political philosophy, and we're going to return to where I left off, probably over a year ago. I don't even remember. It's been a while, but we're going to go into Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 2 this time. That's what we're talking about today. One thing that you should know about volumes 2 and 3 of Capital is that Karl Marx didn't formally write those volumes. They're from his manuscripts, and from his notes basically, and his companion and partner in crime, I guess, or his close buddy, Friedrich Engels. He put together a lot of Karl Marx's manuscripts and notes and journals. He put them together to create volumes 2 and 3. So it does read like that. It very much reads like that, where it reads like somebody was just like kind of putting some notes together, or it's not like loosey-goosey or like scribble scrabble or something like that. It's very formal, and it's very intensive, and it's quite complex, but it does have that feeling of, okay, these are some notes, or this is manuscripts, right? These aren't exactly texts put into the most cohesive way that's like easy to understand or readable. It takes a while to read these. Well, it took a while to read Capital 1, basically because it was so many damn pages. I think it was like near 1,000 pages. This is 600 pages, and this version anyway, the Penguin Classics edition. So it took a while, but it was enjoyable and it was fun, and Engels did a good job putting them together, and this is a good edition in my opinion. And so we're going to talk about what is Karl Marx saying in Volume 2. So what he's saying is that he's breaking down the system of capitalism. The word capital is Karl Marx's critique on capitalism. He talks about, in Capital 1, he brings up a lot of examples of, from the Industrial Revolution, where the working class gets exploited and overworked, and there's plenty of examples of that, how the labor gets pretty much gypped by the capitalists, and the cruelty of capitalism. Volume 3 goes more into depth about how Karl Marx feels that capitalism will eventually fall and fail and crumble, and it will be replaced by a revolution. But before that, in Volume 2, he's discussing, okay, what exactly is this system of capitalism? Like, how does it actually work? How does commodities actually move throughout this economic system? How is capital actually in operation? How does it move? How does it change? In what ways does it operate? So that's what Volume 2 is about. It's like a detailed play-by-play of how capital is moved throughout this economic system of capitalism as a commodity, as money, as revenue, as wage labor, and as profit for the capitalists. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check out some of the formulas that Karl Marx put into this text, these manuscripts, that break down that very process. So let's transition over to an analysis of some formulas. All right, now, here we go. This here is a formula that you see a lot, many times in this text, Capital Volume 2. And in this formula, Karl Marx is trying to explain capitalism as a cycle. He's trying to show you how capital moves throughout this cycle of this economic system of capitalism. Okay, and it's the simple version, or the simplified formula. And this is a good introduction to the later formulas that he brings up, which go into more detail about how capital is moved throughout the system
of capitalism. So we'll get started here. What is this formula? Well, we'll break it down. What do these symbols mean? We have M, and that is money. Okay, it starts off with money. You put money in, and we're talking about the capitalist. Okay, the capitalist puts in money. This money gets transformed, transmutated, metamorphosized, however you want to say it, into a commodity. Commodity is anything like a product or a service. It could be like a cell phone, a marker, scissor. I'm just looking at things on my desk. A lamp, painting, or it could be a service. It could be that too. It could be like a repair job, a cleaning job, any kind of service. Okay, in our capitalistic society, services even go so far as education. That's a service. Unfortunately, that has been commodified or turned into capital. Or healthcare is a commodity now, which is sad but true. That's a commodity. Now, how do you get the commodity? Well, the commodity takes two things to get produced. It takes labor power, that's what this L stands for, and it takes means of production, that's this MP. So labor power is what? Labor power is the worker, the worker that's doing the necessary work to produce the product. But it's not just the worker, right? There's also the stuff that the worker uses to make the commodity happen. Say, for example, your commodity is software. You're selling software. Well, you need a computer programmer to code the software, but you also need like software to code the software. You need some kind of software to organize the code and edit the code and write the code. Right? I think they call those IDEs, integrated development environments, something like that. And then you also need computers, right? That's a means of production. You need a computer to write the code to make the software. So that's a means of production. But you definitely need workers. You need labor power. And what's important as we look at this formula is that it branches off. So we start with money, and the money gets branched off. Some of the money goes to labor power, some of the money goes to means of production, but it is not an equivalent exchange in terms of the actual worker, the person that's doing the work to create the commodity, and the money that's put into the system to create the commodity. There's not equal amounts of money coming in that goes back out to the worker. Okay, that's important as we talk about Karl Marx and his theory of capitalism. Very important. So here we have, it's a more complicated formula. It's basically the same formula that we just saw. It's just in more detail, in greater detail. And we'll break it down. I know this looks it might look a little crazy, but we'll break it down step by step. So we start off with P, commodity product. So what is this commodity product? Well, that's the commodity. Again, that's the service or the product. We're going to talk about, let's use an example. Let's use an iPhone. It's a good example, right? An iPhone. Let's say, okay, we have this cycle of capitalism, and we want to, we're Apple and we're selling iPhones. So what does that take? Well, we start off with an iPhone, and we want to make more iPhones. So we start off with the iPhone, and this iPhone gets transformed into commodity capital. Now, what's commodity capital? Well, we have this C and we have this apostrophe next to the C. So in Karl Marx's formulas, he puts an apostrophe next to these symbols to indicate the addition of surplus value. So that when we talk about surplus value, we're talking about the additional costs associated to the product that's on top of what the product actually costs to get produced. So a product costs a certain amount of money to get produced, and then the capitalist adds even more costs to that product to make money, to make a profit. Right? This business 101. Right? This is how capitalism works. So we'll see this surplus value here. This commodity product, this iPhone, is actually the commodity itself. Okay, so the iPhone itself and its capitalist revenue. So what's that? This little c. So the commodity itself is the iPhone. Now, iPhones, how much do they cost now? I think the newest iPhone costs like $1,100, doesn't it, or something like that. It's over $1,000, which is nuts. That's why I don't own an iPhone, because it's just too dang expensive. But millions of people buy it, so apparently it's worth that much to many people. So does it actually? But the question is, does it actually cost over $1,000 to make an iPhone? No, it does not cost over $1,000 to make an iPhone. It does cost a certain amount of money. How much? Oh, we're not going to know that. They're never going to tell us that. I mean, that's on a need-to-know basis, right? And we don't need to know, of course. I'm sure that's how Apple feels. So you got the cost of how much the iPhone. Well, you got the iPhone itself, and then you got the amount of additional revenue that the iPhone gets for the capitalists. And we see that as it transforms through this system of capitalism as we go down. Okay, so the commodity, the iPhone, costs money to produce. Okay, but on top of the money that it costs to produce, the capitalist associates even more money to that product to make a profit. Okay, right, so this is two separate things. It's the actual cost of the production of the product, and it's on top of that is the amount of money that's added to the cost of the product, so the capitalist can make a net profit. Okay, just repeating this so we understand, we get what's going on here. And so we keep going down this cycle. It turns back into a commodity. This is a new commodity, actually, because we're making we're Apple, and we're making new iPhones. So this is a new iPhone, right? And as we make this new iPhone, we gotta leave behind the money that was the net profit, the additional money that we associated to the product, so that we can make the executives at Apple very happy, and also the shareholders at Apple, so they can get a cut of the money, right? Because they need a return on their investment. But that money has nothing to do with the actual production of the iPhone itself. Okay, and we talked about this before. How does the commodity get produced? Well, it uses labor power, and it uses means of production. The worker needs to put man hours into the creation of the commodity, and the worker gets paid. And also, the worker needs to use tools and other objects, other products to make the commodity. And then from that, we have a new commodity product, a new iPhone. Right? That's how iPhones or commodity products get made. And then the cycle just continues. It repeats itself in this theory of capitalism that Karl Marx is going through here, trying to explain. But what we have to understand, and what Karl Marx is just trying to highlight here, is this branching off. Like, okay, you put all this money into, or this value into the product, the commodity itself, but the laborer, the person that works to make the commodity, only sees a small fraction of that money that's being used to produce or to create this commodity product in this capitalistic system. Right, so what's going on is that the laborer is getting exploited, right? He's getting gypped, right? Because there's no equal exchange. That's what Karl Marx is explaining here. And that's very important in Karl Marx's theory of capitalism. He's trying to show you exactly how the laborer is getting exploited. He's trying to break it down formulaically. He's trying to use a formula to show you in exactly how the laborer is getting gypped, how the laborer is getting exploited, how there's not an equivalent exchange between the actual production, how much the cost it is to actually produce the product, and then how much product is actually worth. The cost of the product. The laborer is getting a very small fraction of that. And that is where capitalism goes downhill, according to Karl Marx.
Now that we've looked at some formulas, the Black Ponderer would not be the Black Ponderer if we didn't go over some quotes, right? And also add some supplementary examination and commentary, right? Because it's not only about understanding the material, it's also about what do you think about the material, and how can you apply this material to today's world to make it hopefully better. Is it possible? Can we do this? That's what the Black Ponder is about. So let's look at some quotes and we'll break some of these ideas down. And this is page 155. The section is the circuit of productive capital, in case you're interested. So Karl Marx writes, the second act, i.e., money into commodity, does not fall into circulation of the individual capital, although it proceeds from it. The constant existence of the working class, however, is necessary for the capitalist class, and so, therefore, is the consumption of the worker mediated by money into capital. So I think that's important, right? He says the working class is necessary for the capitalist. Okay, the capitalist needs the working class, has to have it for this whole capitalism to work. If the working class doesn't exist, then the capitalist doesn't exist. Then he continues, the act, commodity capital into money capital, merely assumes that commodity capital is transformed into money, is sold, so that the circuit of the capital value can continue, and the surplus value can be consumed by the capitalist. The commodity is, of course, bought only because it is a use value, i.e. is suitable for some kind of consumption, productive or individual. So what are we talking about here? Well, let's continue right quick. The whole process follows its course, and with it also the individual consumption of the capitalist and the worker that is conditional on it. This point is an important one in considering crisis. I wrote some notes in the margins to try and understand this. I'll read my note. The whole capitalistic cycle is dependent on the use value of the commodity. The surplus value from the laborer, how much can the worker be exploited? And we talked about that in the formula. So how much can the laborer be exploited? That is the whole crux of capitalism. That's how capitalism operates. It's like the capitalist pushes the laborer to the limit, because the farther the capitalist exploits the laborer, the smaller amount of money the capitalist needs to pay the laborer to produce the commodity, the more net profit the capitalist can make. So it's about pushing it to the limit, like exploiting the laborer as far as that can go. And that is a formula to crisis. And here we are at page 156. The volume of the mass of commodities brought into being by capitalist production is determined by the scale of this production and its needs for constant expansion, and not by a predestined ambit of supply and demand of needs to be satisfied. So the whole fairy tale of supply and demand, like, if there's a demand for a product, all we gotta do is supply it and people will buy it. Well, Karl Marx is saying, well, that's a fairy tale, right? Really is, demand is fabricated. It's fictionalized. There's artificial demand is created and artificial supply is enforced. And if this process is expanded, which includes an expansion of the productive consumption of the means of production, then this reproduction of capital can be accompanied by a more expanded individual consumption and thus demand on the part of the workers. Since this is introduced and mediated by productive consumption, the production of surplus value, and with it also the individual consumption of the capitalist, can thus grow. And the whole reproduction process finds itself in the most flourishing condition, while in fact a great part of the commodities have only apparently gone into consumption and are actually lying unsold in the hands of retail traders, thus being still in the market. And what's being talked about here, I think, is the idea that, okay, how far can we exploit the laborer? Like, if we can't exploit the laborer where we're at now, we need to expand to different markets where we can further exploit even more laborers. So capitalism reaches far out. It goes to other nations, to other countries, to other geographical locations to find ways to exploit the labor even further. And we see this in globalization, for instance, or, a term that's thrown out a lot, neoliberalism, where corporations try to escape regulation by expanding to different countries. They're expanding their operation to different countries where regulation doesn't exist or where regulation is laxed, and they can exploit the labor even further. One stream of commodities now follows another, and it finally emerges that the earlier stream had only seemed to be swallowed up by consumption. Commodity capitals now vie with each other for space on the market. The latecomers sell below the price in order to sell at all. The earlier streams have not yet been converted into ready money, while payment for them is falling due. Their owners must declare themselves bankrupt or sell at any price in order to pay. The sale, however, has absolutely nothing to do with the real state of demand. It has only to do with the demand for payment, with the absolute necessity of transforming commodities into money. At this point, the crisis breaks out. Let me read you some notes on my margin. Okay. Market expansion is a way to offset diminishing use value. So as a capitalist struggles to sell commodity products to make profit, sometimes profits fall in certain regions, so the capitalist has to struggle to different marketplaces to sell commodities at high values, or a value where they can make a profit. They create this artificial surplus value, and the constant need to do that over and over again in Karl Marx's theory leads to eventual crisis, because eventually you're going to run out of marketplace to sell your product at such a high surplus value. Eventually you're going to run out of ways to exploit the labor to create that net profit. It first becomes evident not in the direct reduction of consumer demand, the demand for the individual consumption, but rather in a decline in the number of exchanges of capital for capital in the reproduction process of capital. Karl Marx is breaking it down. Check out this quote. We're on page 157 now. Money into capital at a time determined by the conditions of the process itself, it is withdrawn from circulation only temporarily to step into action and fulfill its function at a definite point in time. This storing of money is then itself a function determined by its circulation and for circulation. Its existence as a fund for purchase and payment, the suspension of its movement, its state of interruption, circulation, is then a situation in which the money fulfills one of its functions as money capital. For in this case, the money that is temporarily dormant is itself a part of the money capital. So what's being said here is, here's my notes, I'm just reading again. Money becomes commodity, hoarded away from social use. So cash, money itself, becomes a commodity. It becomes a commodity to be spent on the production of commodities. So again, it's money that's tucked away and not used to pay for the worker. Also, it demonstrates how money is artificial, how it's just a means to an end, and that's the production of the commodity. All the money that is withdrawn from circulation exists in the form of a hoard. The hoard form thus becomes here a function of the money capital. Check out another one of my quotes. This is just me and my notes, because I can make notes too. It ain't just Karl Marx making his manuscripts. Capitalism must maintain the fiction of supply and demand to continue. Once that fiction can no longer be managed, the crisis begins. That's important to understand. Capitalism is a fiction, is what Karl Marx is trying to say. It is a kind of false reality. This whole supply and demand is a fictional construct. We create these products that people may or may not like, but then we when I say we, I mean the capitalists. The capitalist creates this artificial demand. You have to have this product, and consumers like, oh yeah, okay, I really do need this product. Kind of like the iPhone that we were talking about. The iPhone, nobody really needed an iPhone, but everybody has to have one. Apparently, an artificial demand was created, where it's like, oh, you actually do need this. Within the circuit of industrial capital, money capital performs no other function than those of money, and those money functions have the significance of capital functions only through their connection with other stages of the circuit. So money exists only to create capital and not to compensate society. So what happens is that more and more money gets hoarded away simply for the production of more commodities. And less money is actually used to actually compensate the needs of society, to sustain the needs, the welfare of society. And this is not sustainable. This is what Karl Marx is saying. The more you hoard money away from society, the more likely society will crumble because it will not be able to sustain itself. Let's continue with another quote. This is page 185. Capital as self-valorizing value does not just compromise class relations, a definite social character that depends on the existence of labor as wage labor. It is a movement, a circulatory process through different stages, with itself in turn includes 3 different forms of circulatory process. Hence, it only can be grasped as a movement and not as a static thing. And we showed that on the formula. Like when we went over the formula, capitalism is a cycle, and it's a process, and it's a movement. And that's important to understand. It's a system that's constantly in movement, in flux. Here, value passes through different forms, different movements in which it is both preserved and increases, is valorized. And this is when we talk about surplus value, the fact that a commodity comes in and artificial value is put into that system or that circuit so that the capitalist can make a profit, and then the commodity comes out. So there's this valorization that's happening constantly in the system of capitalism. Capitalist production can exist and continue to exist only as long as the capital value is valorized, i.e. describes a circuit as value that has become independent. And in this sentence is talking about how capitalism only exists through surplus value. That's exactly the way capitalism operates. Capitalism depends on the creation of artificial value. So in a sense, it is an artificial system. It's a fiction. It depends on fiction. And in that way, you can see how, I see how this can crumble. When something is operating off of something that isn't even real, that's false, that can crumble. The movement of capital appear as actions of the individual, industrial capitalist, insofar as he functions as buyer of commodities and labor, seller of commodities and productive capitalist, and thus mediates the circuit by his own activity. So the capitalist both buys and sells the commodity. This is what Karl Marx is saying. And so the capitalist is in control of the system, and the laborer, the working class, has little to no control of this system. If the social capital value suffers a revolution in value, it can come about that his individual capital succumbs to this and is destroyed because it cannot meet the conditions of the movement of value. So no surplus value, no capitalist, and the whole system crumbles. The more acute and frequent these revolutions in value become, the more the movement of the independent value, acting with the force of an elemental natural process, prevails over the foresight and calculation of the individual capitalist. The more the course of normal production is subject to abnormal speculation, and the greater becomes the danger to the existence of the individual capitals. These periodic revolutions in value thus confirm what they ostensibly refute: the independence which value acquires as capital, and which is maintained and intensified through its movements. Let me read you my margin note. Capital must constantly reiterate itself as a valid reality to exist. So the fiction, the false reality, must constantly be reiterated, to be reinforced. Surplus value must constantly be created. Like we used the example of the iPhone that cost over $1,000, but the amount of money necessary to produce an iPhone is not over $1,000. But however, the capitalist has to make up this fiction and tell you like, oh, actually, no, the iPhone is worth that much money. That's how much it is actually worth. And how is this fiction created? I'm sorry, like iPhone fans who think it's actually worth that. And I mean, it might be worth that to you, but Apple says, oh, it's, or even people who admire Apple products, and oh, it's very elegant, and the user interface is so graceful, and it's just like I'm using a product that's so beautiful and elegant to use, and that's why it's worth so much money. And it's just so beautiful to behold, and the design is so amazing, and that's why it's worth $1,000 plus, right? Yeah, you just keep telling yourself that. Just stop this messing. But yeah, that is the sale, the what's being told to sell this product. That's the added value, is that elegance, right? This amazing user interface, this like intuitive use of the way that you swipe the phone in certain ways. Like it's like an extension of the mind and the body. It's like having another limb. And is that really real? I would say it's probably a fiction, but you can buy into that fiction, certainly. And literally that's what you're doing. You're literally spending money for that story that you may or may not believe in. But if someday people were to say, you know what, this user interface, and a lot of people do, plenty of people do not have iPhones, they have Android devices or something, like that's any different. But they have alternatives, right? But there's a lot of people that say, this is just overpriced. This whole elegance and user interface and blah, 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 blah. I don't buy into that. It's not worth that much to me. So they're not going to buy it. They're not going to see the value, the surplus value. They don't think it's justified. So if enough people start thinking that way, they don't believe that the surplus value is real enough to invest in that money, then the whole system, the whole sales model of Apple will fall apart. And that applies to all commodities. It's all based off of fiction, is what Karl Marx is saying. This is page 190. As soon as the act of money turned into means of production is completed, the commodities, means of production, cease to be commodities and become one of the modes of existence of industrial capital in its functional form, productive capital. Their provenance is therefore obliterated. They now exist simply as forms of existence of industrial capital and are incorporated into it. Yet it remains the case that their replacement requires their reproduction, and to this extent the capitalist mode of production is conditioned by modes of production lying outside its own stage of development. So again, we're talking about this fabrication. This way the system kind of uses this fiction to support itself. The intervention of industrial capital everywhere promotes this transformation, and with it too the transformation of all immediate producers into wage laborers. So it's all dependent on the wage laborer. It's dependent on the creation of this fictional value, the surplus value, and it's dependent on whether they can pay the laborer as little as possible to produce the product, while at the same time raising this fictional value, this surplus value, as high as possible to make the most amount of money, to gain the most net amount of profit, not gross profit, net profit. You might have seen in the news, there's like a celebration going on, like what is it, Apple and now Amazon. They're like the first companies ever to reach $1 trillion in profit, or like their value is like $1 trillion, and that's amazing. Like that's a testament to human progress, or to business and capitalism, right? I mean, should we celebrate that? Not really. I mean, is that something that's is that something we should applaud as a human accomplishment? Wow, that's amazing. I mean, no. I mean, first of all, when you're making a product that's like over $1,000, and there's millions of people that buy it, and the product definitely doesn't cost probably nearly as much money to produce, yeah, I mean, you're gonna definitely eventually hit that $1 trillion mark. I mean, that's gonna happen. And how is that happening? Well, people buy into the notion that this phone is worth this amount of money. It'll get out of what pick on iPhone lovers. I mean, if that's how much you feel that is worth, that's how much you feel that is worth. But you do have to admit that the user interface, the design, the elegance of the product, is that really worth that much money, or how much actual definitive tangibility can you associate that feeling that you get with the money that you're putting into buying that product, right? How much is that user experience a fabrication of how your emotions, how you feel about it, compared to like its actual application and its use, and like what you're actually doing with it, right? Also think about how much money that product actually costs to make, to manufacture, to produce, compared to how much you bought that product. Okay, when you think of it like that, you begin to understand what capitalism truly is as a system, how much is really dependent on the creation of value that's fabricated or constructed out of demand that may or may not exist, that's kind of just created out of nothingness rather than necessary. It is a fair analysis of what capitalism actually is as a system. It is very fair, and he definitely goes into detail. There's definitely a lot to think about. And Karl Marx definitely brings up a lot of good points and a lot of truthful points. But what do you think? How do you feel about capitalism and Karl Marx's theory behind it? Again, volume 2 was just an analysis of the inner workings of capitalism in terms of like how the system functions, kind of the meat and potatoes of the system, the anatomy of the system, how it operates from within. the part where Karl Marx starts going into the inevitable crisis and the inevitable fall and failure of capitalism, that's volume 3. So volume 2 is pretty good if you really want to understand the theory of Marxism, Marx's theory of capitalism. So I encourage you to check it out. Again, we're talking about Karl Marx, Capital, volume 2. Well, you have been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.